Welcome to the Beth Yeshua podcast. For more episodes like this, visit bethyeshua.org/media. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Beth Yeshua podcast. I'm your host, Josh Rubinstein, and today I'm here with my mom. Hi, Mom.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I kind of feel like we're co-hosts of this. I know, like, I'm saying I'm the host. I guess that leaves me an out, so, like, I could invite, like, other guests and stuff, too. But I think most of the time we're going to be doing the conversations together.
Okay.
So, I don't know. Maybe we should, like, you're officially a co-host. How about that?
Okay.
And I'm here with my co-host, Shari Rubinstein. Hi, Shari Rubinstein.
Hi, Josh. Great day.
Yeah, what a great day. So today we are going to be in the second conversation about Jewish identity. If you haven't listened to the first one, I'd encourage you to do that because if nothing else, it'll give you a little bit of an idea of where we're coming from as far as our background of identity, and then a little bit of the outline of where we're headed. This is going to be a multi-week, maybe a multi-month conversation as we delve into Jewish identity because Jewish identity is very large. But before we jump in, I just wanted to say once again, if you want to see our faces and not just hear us, please go over to YouTube or to Spotify because you can see the video version of this podcast. You can always see more of us in general at bethyeshua.org. That's BETHYESHUA.org. And there you can find all sorts of things about our congregation, our Messianic congregation, which is in California. So today we're going to be diving in a little bit more specifically to the individual branches of Judaism and even the way that it's kind of culturally permeated Jewish thought of who is a Jew. All of those different definitions within the branches of Judaism. And we're going to maybe talk then also a little bit about where the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations lands, or at least historically landed. I'm not sure. I was looking all over their website, their current website, could not find a standard for Jewish identity anywhere, which is actually, it's maybe a problem. I don't know. I kind of want to talk to somebody about that. And then, of course, we're going to talk about the law of return in the state of Israel for citizenship, making aliyah. And then we're also going to talk about our own community and kind of where we landed on things. But before we go into that, we've got a brand new little intro segment. Today we're going to be doing, what is your favorite old school Messianic Jewish worship song? So for those who don't know, Messianic Judaism has a tradition of actually using instruments and having times of song and often like Israeli-style dance as part of worship. That's part of our expression. And so my mom and I have been around in the worship population within Messianic Judaism for a while. We have years and years of experience. And so I'm going to throw it to you, Mom, first. Which old school Messianic Jewish song do you love?
Well, actually, I thought about this, and I think the one I love the most is "He is my defense," and it goes on with "He is my defense; I will not be moved." And for me, it's more I tend to want to defend myself. I tend to, want to do the battle myself.
Yeah. And
that's another newer song that we sing about the battle. The battle really is all about what God does for us. It's not in our power to win these battles. And so that's a reminder to me. He is my defense. It's a reminder that He is the one who will defend me. And if I'm not okay, if I'm not right, I don't want Him to defend me.
Okay. That's really good. That one is actually really kind of cool too because it has a version of the Shema built into it too. And it's kind of cool. It has like tempo shifts back and forth. And honestly, it's such an old song. I don't remember who actually composed that. I guess I could try to like look that up really quick.
Which one is it?
He is my defense. I don't know who wrote
that. Yes, I don't remember either.
Let's see if I can.
It's not Chernoff, is it?
Oh, well, it's at least performed by Marty Goetz.
Oh.
So
maybe.
I'm wondering if he actually like wrote this. It's possible. It is entirely possible that he wrote this.
How old is it?
Dude,
like in the 60s.
Yeah, it's a really old one.
Yeah.
And actually, that reminds me of mine. I'm just going to Google mine really quick too. I'm wondering who wrote this. Oh, Paul Wilbur.
Paul Wilbur.
That kind of makes sense. So I'm going to say that my favorite old school Messianic worship song is Kadosh. It's like really a very simple song, and it has like both Hebrew and English built into it, but it's a song about the holiness of God. And it also kind of goes into a chorus with a key change into the major instead of the minor. It comes from the minor into the major, and it goes into who was and who is to come. And it's a powerful song. It's really the song that's actually, from what we can tell, it's maybe the perpetual song in heaven. It's the song that's always being sung by the winged creatures and by the elders around the throne of God. So I think that's a pretty cool old school song. And yeah, both of those solid choices. And maybe we'll do more Messianic recommendations from the old school. Or maybe even some newer ones. There's some Mekedem songs that we do as part of our worship that are really wonderful. Okay, we're going to jump in and try to be a little bit more focused in kind of going through each branch of Judaism and talking about who they regard as a Jew. And then there's all sorts of conversations, as you were researching, Mom, about conversion within the branches. And we're going to get to that eventually. We're going to talk about conversion as we go further into this conversation. But for right now, if you were to walk into like an Orthodox synagogue or a conservative synagogue or Reform or Reconstructionist and say, hey, I'm Jewish, or if they were to ask you, are you Jewish? This is what they would be expecting as part of your answer. So why don't I'll throw each one of these to you one at a time. I know you just read a really long and in-depth article about this, but if I was to walk into an Orthodox synagogue, and who would they expect is Jewish according to their definition?
Well, a standard that I think that we'll see in all of the various approaches is that the person is fully engaged in a Jewish lifestyle, and that may vary from different ones. But for the Orthodox, it really means that your mother is Jewish, and halakhically by the law is Jewish. So if your mother has converted into Judaism, if they have accepted the conversion, which they do not necessarily accept the conversions of all the other sects, it's within them to decide that, but they would still consider the person fully Jewish.
Okay.
But it's through the mother, not at all through the father.
So that is interesting too. If you had a woman who had converted to maybe like Reform Judaism, and she had raised a kid in Reform Judaism, and then that kid went to an Orthodox synagogue. The Orthodox synagogue may or may not, by their halacha, accept that person as Jewish. Is that correct?
That's what I'm reading. That's what I'm understanding. That, and a lot of it it hinges on more how well, actually two things. What is their knowledge? Their level of knowledge of Jewish things, the history of the Jewish people, the liturgical aspects of worship, the high holy days, all of the things that are part of Jewish life, they would expect it to be there. And if a person has converted, they would expect that woman would have instilled that in the home and to those children, but they would look to that to be the deciding factor. So sometimes they accept other sects' recognition of whether or not they have affirmed a confirmation. Conversion.
And that's interesting because it is like recognizing the strength of the person's own Jewish practice as a significant part of that, right? And also their Jewish knowledge. A lot of which, of course, if you were raised in a traditional synagogue, you would get as you went to confirmation classes, right? But this is like, maybe you weren't necessarily raised in that, but if you have a strong identification and a strong knowledge and are doing and keeping many of the Jewish practices, then they would say you're Jewish. Okay, and then to be clear, according to the Orthodox, if your father is Jewish, and your mother is not Jewish, those kids would be considered what?
They would not be Jewish.
They would not be Jewish.
Unless the father converted. I mean, pardon me, which did you say? Who is the Jewish one?
The father is Jewish, the mother is not.
The mother is not.
Unless the mom converted, they would
Unless the
not
mom
be Jewish.
converted, they would not be considered to be Jewish.
Even if they were there, going to synagogue, like participating in Jewish life, like I wonder what that would be like. Maybe the rabbi has a conversation with them at some point and says, it seems like you want to raise a Jewish family. Maybe it's time to think about conversion for your spouse.
Well, and the other thing about it is if this couple is in an Orthodox congregation, they're not really recognizing the non-Jewish one as a person to even have they're not really recognizing them as members. Mm-hmm. So there's that aspect of it too. So unless something is done to bring the one who is not Jewish going through some kind of conversion, they will not recognize the kids as being Jewish. Yeah. Now, I'm assuming that once the children are old enough and they go through some kind of process themselves, whatever is required, that they would be considered to be Jewish then,
right? As
an adult,
right? Yeah, and of course, passing it on from generation to generation and conversion does make all of these things very individualized and unique. Every single situation, right? Okay, so conservative, from what you've been reading and from what I've been reading,
yes.
From my understanding, it's very similar to the Orthodox.
Well, the conservative are actually considered to be more of the middle ground between the Orthodox and probably Reform. But let's see, they are saying that non-Jews are not accepted as members. Mm-hmm. Nor are children of non-Jews. The mother is considered Jewish. Let's see how that goes. So this is, okay, we're talking about the conservative, right?
Correct.
The mother, if the mother is not Jewish, they are not considered to be Jewish.
Right.
Still within conservative, yes.
Yep, so same as Orthodox.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and there might be some nuance there, but not much.
No.
Certainly from what I've read. Conservative and Orthodox are pretty much in agreement with this. Okay, and then what about Reform?
Well, and Reform, so they're going to, you'd expect that they would be a little more liberal, which they are. Well, and this is more of a situational thing too. Reform, they really do want both the parents for a married couple to be Jewish. So they really strongly urge formal conversion, but they do. If the person who is not Jewish agrees to maintain a Jewish home and provide their children a Jewish education, to do it rather than requiring them to do it.
Okay.
Let me see.
Within Reform, however, there was at one point, like in the 80s, in the 1980s, there was a paper that was written, and I don't know if there was a formal vote that happened within the Reform movement of accepting patrilineal descent for children.
Yes, and they are saying that. That is one thing Reform has done. They've accepted both. Both patrilineal and matrilineal as being Jewish.
Okay, and
Let me
yet...
just see if they put a requirement on them. No, I don't see that.
Okay, so and yet they would want there to be a unification of Jewish identity between the spouses.
Yes.
But like, let's say that you didn't have that. If you had a Jewish father bringing his children to a Reform synagogue, would those children be considered Jews? Irrespective of the identity of the mother.
If they have a Jewish father, within Reform, is that what you're asking?
Correct.
Yes, they would be considered Jewish. That's my understanding.
Right. Okay. And then Reconstructionist, as you were looking at the Reconstructionist position.
Well, we would expect them to have a less stringent requirement on those coming in. And they basically don't hold to any of the traditional laws or guiding practices or rituals. They do not think that they necessarily, any of them have to be observed. They just want to make sure that they are taking care of the people that show up at their congregation and looking at them. And even if, let's see, one thing they said is if as long as they are committed to raising their children as Jews, they can come in. If they are, let's see, they hold that traditional laws, guiding practices, and Jewish rituals should be observed, but not binding. I messed that up. But not binding. And they do accept non-Jews as members if they are committed to raising their children as Jews.
Wow.
So
that begs a whole bunch of questions, right?
Yeah,
Which is like, what is the purpose of being a Jew if you don't necessarily have to obey Jewish law or commandments, right?
Right.
Although they're saying that they do believe people should do it, but it's just not binding. And I wonder what that means to them.
Well, one of the things they say is that their definition of Judaism is more as an an evolving religion or revolving religious civilization. And their essential unity is derived from its people, the peoplehood, not from the laws and not from the theology.
But that's so
it's
interesting.
It's hard to even understand how it's Jewish. I don't understand.
Because then, and you're also at the same time maybe undermining who is a Jew, potentially. And so then, you could end up with, it sounds like, at a Reconstructionist synagogue, people that simply want to be Jews. And they could take on, quote unquote, Jewish life, whatever that would look like for them. And that may not even be a Jewish person.
Well, I didn't see anything about that, and so I would wonder about that.
Yeah,
but
it does make me wonder because, I know that within Messianic Judaism, we often have Gentiles that come in and are part of Messianic Judaism, and we really love them. They have wonderful hearts, and there can be sometimes among them a desire to be Jewish, right? We'll have people sometimes come and say, "Man, I really want to be Jewish," or I'll have people email me often about converting. They want to convert to Messianic Judaism, right? And so I'm assuming that Reconstructionism would deal with that also. They would have some Gentiles that are interested in being Jewish. And so is it a self-definition? Can you just show up and call yourself a Jew?
Well, it sounds like they have to come in and say something to that effect, but they do allow for a conversion, which makes you think they must be holding to some kind of distinction. Plus, I read that some Reconstructionist rabbis don't permit a non-Jew to be called up for an aliyah, to be called up to read from Torah.
Right.
And even though the Reconstructionists do provide a course of study that can be used for conversion reasons, they have found that they may or may not have a requirement to have a mikvah, which would be like the immersion afterwards. They may or may not have to sit before a Beit Din. And in fact, I think that's interesting because probably most of the other sects do not consider any conversion done at a Reconstructionist synagogue to be
binding,
kosher. I guess I was going to say kosher. You have to be binding to be kosher.
Kosher or treif, a Reconstructionist conversion.
Yeah.
Okay. I think it would be helpful for us, and maybe we can pick Rabbi Brumbach's brain on when he comes into this. I think it would be interesting, not just from the perspective of conversion, but also, the Orthodox don't always abide by conservative conversion. And the conservative don't always abide by a reform one, and a reform doesn't always abide by Reconstructionist, and Reconstructionist sounds pretty loose. And so it's interesting. I think you have the same sort of idea there of a struggle of Jewish identity, or who gets to control or who gets to say what a Jew is or who a Jew is, when you have different definitions of what that should even look like in practical Jewish life, right?
Well, and then when you look at life in America, with American Jewry, and you're looking at probably a third of the Jewish people in the United States are Reform.
Right.
You would think there would be a heavier influence in America from the Reform sect of Judaism.
Right.
And conservative evidently is only 1 in 5 Jews are conservative, and only 1 in 10 are Orthodox. So only 10% of the population is Orthodox. Interestingly enough, about 30% of the Jews in America don't identify with any of the denominations within Judaism.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And that's kind of, I think, what we see. And then another 7% are maybe part of smaller groups, maybe even part of Reconstructionists. But so that's like 37% that don't seem to be very fully engaged in their Jewish identity.
Which makes sense if you just look at the numbers of people being engaged actively in religious expression at all within the United States. And I think actually most of the West, it has declined rapidly. Okay, let's move then from that, where we already don't have agreement of Jewish identity. Let's move into the UMJC, and then we'll go into the Standard of Israel for the Law of Return, and then we'll go into our community specifically. So the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, at least my understanding from back in around probably the 2010 era, was that they held to something very similar to Reform, which was if you had a Jewish father or a Jewish mother and you had a consistent kind of Jewish identity and Jewish expression, and you were living Jewish life, you were considered Jewish. Now, you might be wondering, like, why does the UMJC care? Well, one of the reasons why the UMJC cares is because they have a standard for full membership of a community. Like if you're going to be a full member, you have to have at least 10 Jewish people that are part of your community, right? Isn't that the minimum standard?
Adults, 10 Jewish adults.
10 Jewish adults, right. And so there's a purpose behind that definition of saying, like, okay, we're going to align ourselves with at least part of Jewish life and expression. They're aligning themselves both with Reform, which is 30% of Jewish identity, at least religiously in the United States, and they're identifying themselves in some ways with the Law of Return, which we'll talk about in just a moment, which is more about protecting Jewish people and having a safe place for Jewish people. Therefore, it extends to the grandparents and not just to the parents, right? But so the UMJC, now, right now, I can't find it on their website. Like, if you actually go to, like, what we believe and, like, all this other stuff, you find a lot of things about the Commonwealth of Israel and about Messianic Jewish worship and a variety of other things, but you don't see a clarity of, like, a call to identity. And it's interesting to me, I think that this is just a problem within Messianic Judaism as a whole. I think that there's an unwillingness for us to even have this conversation and to put it out into the ether as a podcast shows a little bit of transparency and boldness that I feel like is missing, honestly, from our movement. I feel like a lot of people are sort of like, don't ask, don't tell when it comes to identity in general. Or it could be actually just straight up confusing. You could have like all sorts of people wearing a tallis on a Shabbat at a Messianic congregation, have no idea who's a Jew and no idea who's a Gentile, and it could all just look the same, this weird homogenous mix of people.
Actually, I'd like to know how many within Messianic Judaism would look like that. I don't know that we've ever put out a survey to say, who wears the talit in your congregation?
Right.
I don't even think we see that. I wanted to say one more thing about the reason for the 10, because 10 is a minyan for prayer. Right. But also, even the conservative made changes when they also made changes from Orthodox that women and men could sit together in the synagogue instead of being separated. One of the other things was that women could be part of the minyan. Right. Because that's a huge thing. So when they ask us to have 10 adults in a Messianic synagogue at the UMJC anyway, to define that we are full members, that is women or men. Right. Which I think is important for people to know.
Yeah. Which, I mean, makes sense if you were to think about our other egalitarian conversation we had recently about women being ordained as rabbis and receiving smicha. Right. I think that the union has always been very kind of like empowering towards women, certainly within like the communities at large. We of course disagree about whether or not they should have the buck stops here sort of spiritual authority within a community, but okay, let's move on from that into the Standard of Israel. Now, whether people like it or not, the standard for citizenship in Israel is, well, it's confusing in its own way. First of all, you have well over 1 million Arab citizens who are part of the nation of Israel and are full citizens and have full citizenship and full citizen rights, which is something that the mainstream press, frequently ignores when they're talking about Israel as a quote-unquote apartheid state. They completely dismiss the fact that there are millions of Arabs that are not just citizens. They have representatives even in the Knesset. So there's that. Then the second part is when the nation of Israel came into existence, it was fresh after World War II. And so there needed to be a clarity of who was going to be considered Jewish for the sake of coming into this new Jewish nation that was, well, not new, but renewed Jewish nation that was springing up in one day. And they decided on really protecting Jewish people that the Nazis would have wanted to kill. So the standards within the Nazi regime was if you had a Jewish grandparent, you were considered a Jew, and you would have been killed. You would have been executed. And so part of the reason for the law of return and the reason why it's built into the Constitution of Israel is because it was a reaction and a desire to protect. And if you think about it, that's still that same existential threat of the destruction of the Jewish people is out there. It is part of the reasons why I'm such a firm supporter of Israel. I know that they don't always have all of their act together, and I know that they're not full of righteous people, but where else can Jewish people protect other Jewish people and be safe from there are many people that want us killed, and anti-Semitism is always real. So the defining reality then was if you had a Jewish grandparent, you could return. There was kind of within this system, however, two different classifications of Jewish identity. There was you were Jewish, which is like Jewish according to religious halacha. So like you were Jewish, like,
and that's controlled by the Orthodox there,
right.
So that would be the mother, right?
Correct. And the Orthodox were given that position of control over the Miswat HaPanim, the Ministry of the Interior, very early on, I believe by Gurion himself. Like there was this like, yes, we don't want a civil war between the secular humanists and the religious Jews. And so you religious Jews, you'll be able to be part of, like a central part of who is a Jew and who is allowed to make Aliyah. And so there was that Jewish, and then there was the of Jewish descent, which was you had any Jewish grandparent and any evidence of that Jewish grandparent at all, right? And so that then is the, like, maybe complex reality within Israel where Jewish identity isn't necessarily tied to religious observance or Jewish, halakha and walking it out, because you can have some very secular humanist people who are Jewish, who are fully Israeli citizens, and yet they wouldn't be recognized often as like Jewish in the religious sense. And so it's interesting. So like sometimes you'll have a conversation with an Israeli. I've had these sorts of conversations, and you'd be like, are you Jewish? And be like, no, I'm Israeli. And what they're making is that distinction of like, no, I'm an Israeli citizen. I'm not an Orthodox. I'm not a conservative. I'm not a religious Jew. And so
well,
that's
and actually, and when you're talking about that, it's when you're saying that they can believe in anything coming in, but that's not actually true. What is it that you cannot believe in?
You cannot believe in Yeshua. You cannot believe that Yeshua is the Messiah of the Jewish people. That's about it. Although, to be fair, in the recent turns of the Supreme Court, they have also rejected practicing Muslims who are Jewish by birth. So one of the court cases that came down was, I believe it was a Muslim woman. I don't know for sure. Her mother was Jewish. Right, so she's actually
should be halakhically Jewish.
Halakhically Jewish, even though she was raised Muslim, so therefore maybe not halakhically Jewish, because there was no identification of Jewish identity at all. And she was wanting to make Aliyah. She was like wanting to come and be a citizen of Israel, and the Supreme Court said, no, this is a bridge too far. It's similar to what they say with Messianic Jews. Like, no, this is a bridge too far. You believe in a pagan God. You don't believe in Judaism. Therefore, you are not actually a Jew. It's the same reason. Literally, that court case is used to block Muslims, and it's used to block Messianic Jews.
Is that the 2008 ruling?
No, it was the one that was much more recent.
Oh, the recent one. Okay.
It was the one that I don't want to necessarily go into too many details, but when our lawyer in Israel heard about this court case and its decision, they said, you need to pull your paperwork, because we were involved in a court case also. And so that was the decision that led to us realizing, like, until things change, until Messianic Judaism actually has any sort of a seat at the table, no. And this, this to me, before we get into our halacha within Beth Yeshua, it raises a really important question, which is, who cares what Messianic Jews think? I mean, honestly, right?
Why? Why would they? Right?
Like, so, and it's interesting to me, just like as a very practical person. I'm a high school teacher, right? And I know that the culture I create in my classroom, that's what wins every single time. The culture, the behaviors that I allow, what I demand of my students, what they are willing to give in the classroom, their relationships with one another, that is actually the reality of my classroom. It does not matter what's up on the wall. All that matters is how we actually live in our classroom. It's the same within Jewish life. It's the same actually within most, I would say, organizations, right? Whether it's an organized religion or a company even. There's a cultural reality, and if you don't abide by that cultural reality, you're often not even part of the conversation. It's like you're so far afield. It's like, who cares what you think? So when you have a conversation, when I have had, I'll just make it very personal, when I have had a conversation with, like, for example, a woman who maybe she's not Orthodox now, but she was either raised Orthodox or she was raised conservative, and I say, yes, I'm Jewish. She says, is your mom a Jew? That's all they care about. That's the end of all of Jewish definition, right? And we need to be very clear about that, even though we might disagree with that, and Reform disagrees with that, and there's some interesting ways that even the nation of Israel disagrees with that. You can be of Jewish descent without being Jewish. It some ways doesn't matter when it comes to your everyday interactions with other Jewish people. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think we forget that within Messianic Judaism sometimes, especially when it comes to how we interact with and are perceived by the rest of the Jewish people. So, like, we're here in a particular, place in California, and the Jewish people behave in a certain way, and it doesn't matter how much, I have very reasonable explanations for why I think patrilineal descent is valid for considering a person a Jew. If they don't believe it, it's like it's a non-conversation. And we have this often even with, like, non-Jewish people that are part of our community, and they'll be like, well, I really want to be considered Jewish, or I want to take on a lot of Jewish life. And it's like, why? Like, that's not necessarily going to help you in other Jewish people and the conversation that you might have with a Jewish person that doesn't yet believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. If anything, it's going to confuse them. They're going to wonder, why is a non-Jewish person doing all of these Jewish things? And the reason that they would wonder that about the Gentiles in our community is because they wonder that about the Jews in our community. They're like, here's this dude, his name is Shari Rubinstein, but, like, is he even really a Jew? His name could have been changed. We don't know. Like, and do you light candles on a Friday night? And is your wife a Jew? And are you raising did they have bar mitzvahs? Were they circumcised? Like, these are the immediate conversations that come up. And it's a mixture of, like, life cycle and practice and identification and intermarriage or non-intermarriage, which we'll get into. So it's exceedingly complex.
Yes.
I
just still, I understand that sometimes I feel like I'm oversimplifying when I look at the Bible, and it's all patriarchal when I look at the Bible. And I realize that some of the sects of Judaism are not just looking at the Tanakh, at the Bible. Right. They're also looking at oral traditions and commentaries, et cetera, but I just don't know how we can go back and negate that. I mean, I realize, when you're looking at people like the Reconstructionists who say, hey, it's all about modern times, let's just make sure we're dealing with our modern day, whoever presents themselves as a modern day person and thinks that they're Jewish, let's just kind of deal with that and deal with them. instead of, is there no absolute truth? Is
Right.
there nothing that we can look back at and say, if I did not think there were absolute truths and some very specific truth, I would not have survived to this day. I know that
Right.
because decision making for me has to go back again and look at not just the individual scripture, but the context in which it's written, who it was written for, etc., before I can understand what was being said. And I cannot anywhere see. I mean, to me, it would be more of a question of why are we taking the mother as the definer of who is Jewish when it's always been patrilineal, you know?
Right.
But
Right.
anyway, sorry, I get off on my
get
own
that.
little
We had
personal
a-
tirade, you know.
And
But
we had a good conversation about that last time, and even just before we started recording, we talked about there is a power of the mom within the home and establishing culture, and like you said, so much of it is transmitted through the dinner table and food and the customs and the practice and how we do what we do. But there is also a power of the father, of like, you know, we will go to synagogue together, we will be a Jewish home, we will be a Jewish family, and a unification of those things. And yes, there can be some surrendering of one to the other. You know, you could have a Jewish father and a Gentile mother could say, you know what, yes, let's raise Jewish children. Let's take on Jewish practice, not because I need to, but because I want my children to be identifiably Jewish. You could have that with a Jewish a non-Jewish father also wanting to surrender and say, yes, we have Jewish children, you and I, and so like let's raise them to be Jews. There's this power of unification. If you were to say, though, that one person maybe has a disproportionate amount of influence in that young person's life, traditionally it's the mother who is actually going to be there during those initial times, or at least the initial years of nurturing and building of identity, and like, well, why do we light these candles, and like, what does this mean? And like, you know, it's the whole idea of Passover. Like, when your kid asks you, you give them an answer, right? And that identity passage, that door to door, is real. It's definitely real. And I think it's why when we're looking at like Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionists, many of them are like, you have to actually grab a hold of Jewish life. You actually have to say, I believe in Jewish life. I'm going to raise my kids to be Jews. We're going to understand the Jewish history. We're going to understand the commandments. We're going to understand even the culture and how to live as Jews.
Well, you know, to me that brings up the question then is, what is the role of the man? And when I'm looking at society today and I'm looking at the research today, when kids do not have a good identity, a healthy identity, it usually goes back to the absence of or an inappropriate relationship with the father.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
the fathers are missing.
That's
and
right.
when we start to define everything by the mothers again, it's almost like, as somebody in our congregation said to several of us recently, it's almost like emasculating the men. It's saying, where's the power of the men? Why are we just saying, okay, women, just be strong, go ahead and do everything you do, but forget the fact that it's a key important part to who every kid identifies as. In fact, little girls get their identity from dad.
That's
They get
right.
so much of that. Dad thinks I'm smart. Dad told me to hand him that screwdriver, and I knew what it was. And
Right.
and they get that identity and that sense of worth and value from the dad.
Right.
Moms, I don't think my kids get their value from me. I think they get their love. They know their love. It's unconditional, but at the same time, when it's time to figure out who you are, they often, boys and girls, are looking to the dad, but especially the boy, to see those absences of the men in the home is so striking that, of course, we're going to see it in Judaism too. We're going to see the same thing going on, and everybody almost like continuing to move on. Well, we're ignoring the fact that the men are not being the ones who are coming forth and saying, my children, this is the way my household is going to be.
Right.
Many are not saying it, and I'm not sure, I'm sure it's very complex why that occurs, but I think especially within Judaism, and I will say this, coming in as a woman who was born Gentile, for me, I had to understand the importance of the covenant relationship with God that the Jewish people have, that's not just important as a family, it's important for the world. It's important scripturally.
Right.
And there cannot be that identity fully going forth without that impact of the man. Well, sorry about that. I had a phone call that broke through.
No worries.
I am not the techno one of the gang here. So.
That's fine. No, don't worry about it. These things happen.
Well, I just really wanted to kind of make the point about the role of men in identity for all children, male and female. And somehow it just feels like it's the biggest struggle that's going on in the world, but specifically in America, is this whole thing of your identity is totally content. You can just have your mom. You can be content with what she's conveying to you. And yes, she loves you, but the actual identity of whether or not you're approved is still this sense that it's got to come from that dad. And to me, when we, we're barely letting it be said that men can be the determiner of your identity of whether or not you're Jewish is just such a strong hit, again, to men.
Sure. Yeah, I could really actually talk about this forever.
Wax philosophical on this one, right?
I have a lot of thoughts about the decline of healthy masculinity and the call by so many people that many of the traits that I actually consider to be good masculine traits are called toxic. I actually believe that I'll just go back to your point. You said earlier, and I thought it was really interesting the way you phrased it. We often receive, I think you said, love from our mothers, but value from our fathers, which I thought was interesting. So first of all, I just want to talk about the scriptural reality. We receive so much value because we know that we are loved by God as our Heavenly Father, and He does not approve of all of our behavior.
Absolutely.
He has a standard for our behavior, and we frequently don't hit it, and He doesn't say, "That's okay, honey." He says, you need to repent. You need to do teshuvah. You need to turn from your wicked ways, and you need to come back to me. I feel that there is a healthy part of men that is actually hard. There's a part of men that is a little bit hard-nosed and hard-edged, and it's certainly, it can become toxic, but it is also the part of receiving value and affirmation that actually means something. It's the whole reality of everyone gets a trophy for participating. Many dads consider that to be absolute nonsense. If you lose, you don't get a trophy, and you don't get a trophy till you win. And if you don't win, you keep struggling until you win, if that's actually valuable to you. And that's one of the reasons why within men culture, we don't really look kindly on people giving up. You're supposed to struggle. And I'm sorry, but this world is a place of struggle. And so there is a part of a man having a standard of behavior or godliness or right within the home even, and children knowing that they have to live up to that standard. Now, can it become oppressive and horrible? Yes, because we're all sinful and broken. Yes, but there's a part of it that's true, because when a man who's a hard man, who works hard and has high standards, looks you in the eyes and says, good job, that I saw what you did there, good job, that means something. And it means something, it like gives you a warm feeling inside of your body. You can physically feel that affirmation. And so I don't think you're wrong. And I think it is part of like our whole conversation. And I know we're getting canceled for all of this, and I don't care. Because
what does that mean, we're getting canceled?
Canceled is like people are like, oh, you're just, affirming toxic masculinity.
Oh,
and
no.
so like, if we had comments turned on YouTube, God forbid, it'd be full of everybody telling us how backwards
Josh,
and Neanderthal I am.
Tell me what it was like for you when you played chess with your dad and he never let you win.
Right.
How did it feel when you finally beat him?
Oh, it was amazing. It was amazing, right?
Because you knew he wasn't letting you win.
Right.
Now let me tell you how I played Monopoly with your son, Micah. For a long time, I played kids' rules. And so I rigged it so he was always winning. and I'm not doing that anymore, but I did it when he was little. And to me, that's just a classic difference between the way I'm coming at it as a mom and a grandma and the way you're coming at it. You're saying you will win honestly when you're able to do well at this.
Right.
And I'm going to stick with you till then. Hey, Dad loved to play chess with you. Right?
Right. It's interesting too. I've heard a lot about this. There was one study that was done with, I believe it was laboratory rats or mice, about the power of play, especially with fathers and offspring, and the amount of, I forget what chemical even it like released in the brains of the little rats or whatever when they would wrestle with and kind of fight with the bigger rats, and it was like really a positive interaction for the mental health of both. It released a lot of really positive chemicals. However, if the little rat just gets dominated over and over and over again by the big rat, it actually gives up at some point, and it actually just like becomes like detached even from all the rest of the rats or the mice or whatever it was. But every now and then, the older rat will allow the younger rat to win, and like you're like, oh, you got me, right? Which we still do when we do like wrestling, physical play, and part of that is teaching.
Yes.
Part of that is like when I wrestle with my son, when I wrestle with my 9-year-old, he's not physically strong enough to get me to tap out, but I teach him ways like, well, if you were being really smart, you'd be able to get that rear choke on me like right there, and you'd be able to lock it with the other hand, and you'd be able to tap me out. And he's so excited to try it out and like tap me out. And there's a power in that, right? There's a real power in that play. And like, if my dad wanted to, he could crush me, but I win sometimes. You know what I mean? And man, there's a real sweetness in that. Anyways, I think that's enough of that rabbit trail. But let's do talk about it if we could. If not, I don't think it's too artificial of a switch to talk about. We do believe that there's a place within Tanakh, within the scriptures, for patrilineal descent of Jewish identity as well as matrilineal descent of Jewish identity. I see both in the scriptures. And so if we were to look at our Halacha at Beth Yeshua, which we know doesn't align with all of Judaism, nor does it align with all of Messianic Judaism. In fact, as we were discussing just recently, I don't even know what the standard is within most Messianic Jewish congregations. I feel like it should be on everybody's website so there's a clarity. Instead, it feels like you could just walk in and self-define as a Jew, and people are like, okay, cool. That is weird and diluting to their actual real prophetic call on the Jewish people. I don't understand the place of that. Like, you need to have a clarity of identity within your community, just period. I don't understand people like wanting lack of clarity just in their lives. Like there's no structure, there's no order if you don't have clarity. Anyway, so.
Well, it's almost like God made a mistake when he made me whatever I am.
Right.
Surely he meant to make me Jewish. Surely he meant to make me whatever.
Right.
And so it's.
Or I'm going to go digging for it. And I will tell you.
Further distrust.
It is often a valuative proposition too. It's like I'm digging for this thing because I feel like it's more special. It is more special to be a Jew than it is to be a Gentile. I have, newsflash. It is not.
Hence the word chosen.
Right.
I mean, that word chosen has been thrown up a lot.
Right. But it's really interesting. We actually read, like in the scriptures, especially in the Brit Hadashah, there's this reality of Jew and Gentile as royal priesthood, holy nation. That's no slouching terms. Like those are big deals. So I'm going to read our halakha really quick, just right off of our website. This is off of our frequently asked questions. Because of the prophetic importance of our Jewish people returning to Israel, our Jewish identity halakha is based on the ability of a person to make aliyah or to immigrate to Israel. So, number one, following the consensus of Jewish tradition, we recognize as a Jew anyone who is born of a Jewish mother or who is a convert to Judaism. Beth Yeshua does not endorse the current, quote, conversions occurring within Messianic Judaism by groups like the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council. But so to unpack that a little bit, what that means is if a person had converted to Orthodox Judaism before they became a follower of Messiah, and then they came into Beth Yeshua and they had a bat mitzvah and they had a formal conversion and sat before a Beit Din, it would seem pretty weird for us to be like, sorry, you're not a Jew. Like that would be very strange to us. Now, if a person had already come to faith in Yeshua, and then went through a conversion, especially within Orthodox and conservative tradition, in which many times you're required to denounce or renounce the name of Yeshua as Messiah, as a false God, man, there'd be a real complex conversation there. But anyways, number 2, we also recognize as a Jew anyone who is born of a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, if that person has undertaken public and formal acts of identification with the Jewish faith and people. So once again, it's that
the identity
standard you see and you outlined for us so elegantly there at the beginning of there has to be actual identification with Jewish life. Number 3, we also recognize as a Jew anyone who would be able to make aliyah to Israel under the law of return. If, however, the person has not been raised in a Jewish home and has not undertaken public and formal acts of identification with the Jewish faith and people, we will require a period of discipleship with a Jewish believer of the same gender in order to bring them to full and meaningful Jewish participation within our community. There's a couple of reasons for that.
Right.
Yeah, so first of all, if you have a Jewish grandparent, it doesn't mean that you were raised Jewish at all. Like it actually, very often what we find is quite the opposite. You're not raised Jewish, or maybe it's completely hidden from you and you had no idea, and you've like lived, I don't know, a third of your life as a Gentile, and you find out you're a Jew. And like it was there the whole time. There's actual like physical evidence of that. It's like, whoa. It doesn't mean that you should jump right into like orthodoxy and conservative practice, right? We believe in a slow movement towards observance in general because we want people to make sure that there's freedom and empowerment by the Holy Spirit, and that things are done out of love rather than out of like a hard-nosed sort of obligation, right? And so we do, though, believe that that person is Jewish. Like they would be recognized as of Jewish descent if they went to the land of Israel. And so they would be able to become citizens of the land of Israel. And so for us, that means that the person is a Jew. Now, you seem like you wanted to add something to that.
No. I was echoing. I mean, I'm right with you on what you're saying. We have some people that have come to us even more recently that's been the case, where somebody has found out, was actually adopted, right, and found out that they were Jewish. And so our hope is that they will begin to walk that out, but we're not talking about Gentiles coming in and doing that. We're talking about people who have a Jewish identity that is provable.
Right. And that actually goes into our fourth article here.
Yes.
All of the above standards for Jewish identity must be established by tangible physical evidence of Jewish descent and practice. So, for example, we had a person at some point join our community, and they actually had like the registry from the immigration center that showed that their grandparent there was Jewish right next to them, as their ethnicity.
Was that on the boat manifest or something coming into Ellis Island?
It was something like that.
Something like that, right.
I don't know if it was Ellis Island. I don't know if it was that far back, but
I don't know.
It was something like that, right? And so it's like very clear evidence.
Which was a heavy thing to put down that you're Jewish.
Totally.
In some of these times, we're talking about that would have been,
maybe dangerous.
Life-threatening.
Right.
Yeah.
So, for example, we have here Jewish gravestones, Brit Milah certificates, Bat Mitzvah certificates, Ketubim, like a ketubah, like a marriage contract. We do not accept, quote, word-of-mouth confessions or testimonies of, quote, Jewishness that have been passed down by families. And that's just because sometimes people are mistaken. And also we believe that if God wants this person to identify as a Jew, he can provide that physical evidence. And if it's not there, then they would never be accepted, not even for Aliyah, not even like as Jewish descent, much less Jewish. And so to suddenly do that would be basically a de facto conversion. And number 5, we do not recognize as Jewish those who claim to have Jewish DNA. DNA, quote, evidence is still primarily geographically based, and as such is a speculative science. DNA, quote, evidence is also not allowed as proof of immigration to Israel. DNA evidence will probably never be allowed as proof for immigration to Israel, since the current Palestinian people are an exact DNA match with current Israelis. So
it's like living next door to somebody in a heavily Jewish neighborhood. Does not make you Jewish. I mean, because that's basically what's being said. Yeah.
You might take on some culture, but yeah.
Now, I will say this about that. Isn't there I don't know how far back the DNA goes, but because it's tracing where your peoples were, you know, I don't know how many hundred years it goes back. So some things could predate that may never show up. Because for me, with my Native American background, it never shows up. But we know. My mother's grandmother came off the Cherokee Nation.
Right.
You know, and her father, my mother's father, my grandfather, married a woman who's almost half Choctaw.
Right.
So these are not just stories in the family. They come off reservations.
Right.
Which I have to say, the American Indian people are not real keen on somebody coming onto the land and saying, "I'm Native American."
Right.
you either is or you ain't type thing. You know, they're gonna make you prove it. So it's pretty good when they're coming off the reservation. You can pretty well be certain that that's who they are.
Yeah, it's
but it doesn't
interesting.
show up on the DNA. It doesn't show up
Yeah, it's weird.
on our DNA. I don't understand it.
Yeah. And so it is interesting too when you talk about, like, there are gatekeepers for identity. So the
Yes.
Native Americans, like, have gatekeepers for their identity, and they have, like, standards which they've and this is a hard place for us, because we, Messianic Jews, we're not the gatekeepers of Jewish identity.
No.
So here we are gatekeeping, if you will, about some Jewish identity in our congregation, and yet our identity standards would not be enough, really, for a person who was going to be part of an Orthodox synagogue or a conservative synagogue. And so it certainly is a very difficult thing. We're not claiming that our definition is in any way superior, nor are we saying that, like, all of Judaism should bow to what we believe as far as identity. But our Halacha was hard fought. We spent years, and I mean literally 2 years, in prayer about this, having many conversations. That, like, for those 2 years, every single week of our elders' meetings, we spent at least half the time talking about conversion and identity and who should be a Jew within our community. And man, it was so hard. It was so hard to come to a final decision that all of the elders agreed on. And it was hard because some didn't want to agree on it at all. Like, I don't want to be the Jew police. And it's like, yeah, dude, I don't either. But I have seen confusion of identity waylay entire families for years. For years. And I've seen the people that struggle over a false Jewish identity confuse their children, and it messes up their own spiritual walk, their children's spiritual walk, and the whole family's spiritual walk. So this stuff is not light. There's real spiritual consequences to people not being able to agree about Jewish identity.
Well, Josh, I was going to say that sometimes, because we're on the West Coast, things look a little different, come out a little differently in a Messianic congregation. You know, we get a lot of people coming in, and where on the East Coast you might expect that most people going into a Messianic congregation are Jews. But we get a lot of people that are not Jews coming in, but love the Jewish people, love Jewish things, want to learn Hebrew. And before we're 34 years old as a congregation. So before we set down some of these stricter things, which in the beginning, frankly, Josh, we didn't have to do, because it was started by Jews who wanted a place to worship as Jews, to worship the Messiah has come with other Jews.
Right.
And so it wasn't an issue, but as it became more of an issue, it was very difficult, because who gets to read from Torah? Who makes Aliyah?
Right.
Who gets to come up and make Aliyah and read from Torah? And anybody could, and who was wearing a tallis? Anybody could, and just by their own if they chose to.
Right.
The only thing we do, probably that's part of our halakha, is when we're up reading from the Word, we do have the women cover their head if they've ever been married, or have a scarf on their shoulders if they're unmarried, But other than that, we have.
Isn't there scripture like a married woman should cover her hair because it's her glory, or something like that?
And you know, you could get back to, was that spoken to just Jews, or was that spoken to Jews and Gentiles, or any believer? But that has become our halakha. If we're wrong in that, I'm sure at some point we will correct that. But in terms of who puts on a tallis, it is somebody who is a verifiable Jew, whether male or female.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that goes into like what we were going to conclude with, our kosher or treif.
Oh.
But man, you know what would be a really interesting conversation is we we've been around in Messianic Judaism long enough to have experienced the beginning when there was really no identity confusion, and it was because
Right.
like nobody was seeking out Messianic Judaism at all.
Right.
And then to see the flood, well, really it began as a trickle of Gentiles that were curious about it, become a flood, and then to see the confusion and Hebraic roots spring up, and one law, and Ephraimite, and two house, and all of this other stuff, and all of it spring up. We've watched it all happen. I think it'd be an interesting podcast for us to talk about the early days, and then like how disorienting it was when things were changing, and so there became a need for a clarity of identity.
Yes.
That, like, if you're not practicing this now in your Messianic congregation, pray about it. You really should have some clarity of identity, because this is not the 80s anymore. This is not even the 90s, man. I'm telling you, the internet, and maybe primarily the internet, has completely, radically shifted what Gentile curiosity about Messianic Judaism looks like. Period.
You know, if you look at everything that's going on right now in Israel, etc., it's like even at the time of the Holocaust, you think, who wants to be a Jew that's not a Jew?
Right.
You know, why would you want that? There's some, it's a weirdness. It's a thing about the chosenness. But, you know, Paul made it very clear. If you love the Jewish Messiah and you are Gentile, stay as you were called. Stay in the position you were in when you were called. If you were a slave, you know, you might seek to not be a slave anymore. But that you're to be called, you're called in that position. And he has purposes for it. To the end of the times, he has purposes for all the nations.
Man, and we should have a whole podcast where we celebrate the role of the Gentile. It is actually the Gentiles who have overwhelmingly helped rebuild the nation of Israel.
It is.
It is Gentiles that have helped people make Aliyah. It is like literally Gentiles who are fulfilling the prophecies of, you know, carrying the daughters of the Jewish people back to the land on their shoulders.
Yes.
It is the Gentiles, it is the nations that facilitate these. It is the nations that are actually provoking Jewish people to jealousy about Messiah and actually bringing people to faith in Messiah. And I still think that that's an actual spiritual anointing. I think that Paul was writing about like a spiritual office, if you will.
Absolutely.
That the Gentiles have an anointing that Jews do not have. And I'll tell you, it is real. Like as a Jew, when I go talk to other Jews who do not believe in Messiah, they see me as a traitor. But when a Gentile rolls up and has the same conversation with them, maybe even word for word, they're like, "Oh, tell me more. This is very interesting. I'm very curious." It's what are you talking about? So, yeah.
Well, let me just add one more thing to that, because back in the day when we came to faith, and I came back, I had come to the Lord as a kid, but when I came back to believe in Jesus, together with your father, who was believing in Jesus for the first time. But when Don Compton, the man who went to the hippies in New Mexico and wanted to reach out to the hippies, when he wanted to have a ministry to them and he felt called to a ministry and he was praying, God called his ministry Shalom. And Don is not Jewish.
Yeah.
Don has never claimed to be Jewish.
That's right.
But this whole wave of Messianic believers that came to the Lord came because of Don Compton.
Right.
And if you ask any Messianic Jew today, who led you to the Lord? They're not going to tell you it was a person that was wearing a tallis because they were trying to make me jealous about my Judaism. No, they were going to say it's a Gentile who made me understand, because they love the Jewish Messiah. That, and it's my Messiah they were telling me about. So, you know, I mean, the role of the Gentile to be confused is really a travesty, because the role of the Gentile is key to what God is doing in the world.
Absolutely.
Amen.
Well, let's quickly end with kosher or treif. Okay, you walk into a Messianic synagogue, and as you're walking through the foyer or through the lobby before you go into the sanctuary, there's a rack there, as you often have in many like Orthodox and conservative, maybe even Reform synagogues, with tallies, with talitot, with taluses there. So if you forgot your tallis bag at home or you don't have one, you can put on a talit if you were bar mitzvah. Should Messianic synagogues, however, because we have many Gentiles who come into our communities, should we have a rack of prayer shawls, of taluses, at the front of our communities?
Gosh, you really want me to answer this?
Yeah, I want you to answer it.
I
I mean,
think
that's
I
the point.
just
Like,
did.
we're just
I
trying to
think
be,
I just
we're trying to
did.
get canceled as quickly as we
I
possibly
know.
can.
Well, this may cancel us because
All right,
we
let's
have some
do it.
people we love.
I know.
And they
I
do
know.
this.
I know they do.
But
Yep.
it's such a wrong message for us to do. I see why it's done in a synagogue where 95% of the people walking in are Jewish, and non-Jewish people wouldn't even presume to put one on. It would be odd for them to put one on.
Isn't that such a different culture?
It is. So for us, within our culture, when we have a tallis out there and we have them auto rack, looking as if everybody should take them, then you even get into, should a woman wear a tallis, right? So it's like, oh, it's there. It's for us to put on. And I have to say, it's got to be treif. I mean, it's got to be treif for us too. And we have to remember, we are not a traditional synagogue in the fact that people who come to us are traditionally Jewish. That's not our reality.
Right.
So we have to act according to our reality.
I know a lot of people want their congregations to look like or feel like a synagogue so that Jewish people will be at home. But man, we don't have the same population. We don't have the same people walking through the door. There's a lot of issues we deal with that synagogues they just don't even deal with. It's like not even on their radar. So I agree with you. This is true.
And add to their confusion. We're adding to the confusion. What a mixed message. Then they come inside, and the only person who is using a tallis is somebody who is Jewish, that's up reading from Torah, etc.
Right.
And then we've had people come in wearing a tallis, their own tallises, and they wanted to go up, and they were told by our Chabad, you may go up and read from the New Testament, which is one of the things we do as Gentiles, but you're not to wear your tallis,
right?
Because this person's not Jewish.
Yeah. And it's so interesting to me. I'm not going to name the ministry. Some people will probably know, unfortunately. But last week, 2 weeks ago, one of my fellow elders came to me and was like, "Hey, I support this ministry, and I didn't ask them to, but they mailed me a talit."
No.
And I was like, "What?
You're talking about one of your Gentile elders?"
Yes. Yes. And like, it wasn't because like he filled out the paperwork. Yes, I'm Jewish, and I really wish I had a talit that was like specifically like these. No, like they just like, hey, you donated. Here's a talit. And I'm like, whoa. Come on, man. What you're doing is you're like sending out prayer shawls to and like, that's such a cultural garment. It's like, it's not just putting fringes on the borders of your garment. And like, not even like recognizing that was given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's descendants, but like, it's very clearly the way the Jewish people have chosen to obey that commandment. And so like, you're giving it out, really, you're giving it to Gentiles. You're mailing tallises to Gentiles.
But the fact that it's being given, and the Jewish people will tell you they earned it.
Right.
They've earned it the hard way.
That's right. Amen on that. Well, that's a good place to end. As always, folks, if we haven't already offended you enough and you want to come back for more, check us out on Spotify, YouTube, if you want to see our faces. So you could just watch us blush as we bring up like horribly controversial things. But we will be back next week with a conversation where we begin to move from this into like, okay, there's sticky places then within identity. Let's talk about intermarriage. Both of us just had the opportunity to be part of an intermarried bris celebration for a Brit Milah for a young boy from a Jewish intermarried family. And so what did that look like? And it was really cool. And I think it's important for us to have those sorts of conversations and to talk about that. So we'll get into that next week. And then hopefully very soon after that, we're going to have some guest rabbis jump in and talk to us about clarity of identity and also specifically conversion. We're going to be having several big conversations about conversion. So I'm excited for that. Thank you so much, Mom. I really appreciate you.
Oh, I appreciate you too, dear.
All right.
Is it okay to call you dear on the podcast?
You can call me dear.
Okay,
it's fine.
Bye, dear.
It's fine. All right, bye-bye. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can always visit bethyeshua.org for more.